Ghosts Among the Ruins. By Elton Gar. Ollie had remained alone, even though several small groups had tried to recruit him. He refused to kill, but that was only part of the reason. He could have worked with them without fighting. The bigger part was that their incompetence would get him killed. Having left the city just before the first attack, he had spent the last 2 weeks in the deepest forest he could find. He had still seen the aliens, who seemed intent on abducting every human on the planet, along with most of the animals. More people would just make him an easier target. He had seen only a few people in that time. Most of them pretending to be soldiers as they ran around the woods with guns they barely knew how to use, prepared to shoot at aliens that had technology that allowed them to abduct entire cities at one time. As a real soldier, Ollie wanted to tell them how little they were likely to gain from the fight. But he wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a man of peace. Mostly, the people he saw wanted to share information. That put him in the awkward position of admitting that he hadn't really been paying much attention to the news. He had known the aliens had arrived, but once it was clear they couldn't communicate, he stopped paying attention. Everyone else had their theory. The most common was that they were here to enslave all of humanity. But some believed they wanted to do medical experimentation, and there were a few that assumed they were eating people. Ollie didn't waste his time thinking about that. But he let the others talk. He even took one of the pistols that was offered to him. Though as soon as the other man was out of sight, he took the gun apart, so he would be less tempted by it. Instead of fighting, he would move deeper into the thick woods every day, in hopes that they wouldn't be able to follow him. That was when he saw a group of 3 aliens. Tall, thin, brown-skinned creatures with breathing masks and strange technology. The masks covered much of their face, but their eyes seemed to scan the forest. Then one of the team of 3 must have heard him, because it spun towards him, shooting a purple beam into the woods. Everything it hit disappeared, but it didn't just leave a hole in the tree. The entire tree was gone, even the roots seemed to disappear as the earth began to sink in. Ollie didn't wait to see what they shot next, beginning to run in the opposite direction as fast as he could. As the aliens followed, Ollie almost hoped that one of the Rambo types who were hiding out here would see him and intervene. He even thought about the pistol. 3 more shots came through the woods, each of them clearing a narrow path as they erased anything that it struck. But while their weapons were impressive, the aliens themselves weren't designed for Earth. They moved slowly with long, slow strides, and they remained clumped together, clearly aware that humans could and would fight back. He circled around them and was gratified to see that they didn't have any skill at tracking him. He watched them from the woods for a few minutes. They weren't just hunting humans. They were hunting anything. They shot squirrels, birds, flowers, and a small family of deer. The last bothered Ollie the most. Hunting for food was one thing, but the aliens wouldn't even get a trophy for killing the fawns. They seemed to be doing it for no good reason. That was enough to get him to think about the gun on his belt again. And if he thought he could win against all 3, he'd be more tempted. But he had sworn an oath to himself that he'd never kill anyone again, and the only chance he would have when outnumbered was to kill them before they could react. Instead, he moved to his next plan. The cities had been emptied completely, or so the few radio broadcasts he had been able to get a few days ago had said. There weren't even rats or mice left. Just abandoned buildings. If that were true, then the aliens would have no reason to go there. So he circled back. That night, he slept in a hole that had probably been created from a disappearing tree. He had slept in worse, and at least it gave him cover. The next morning, he began to move again. Twilight and sunset were the best times for movement because he could see well, and it might be easier to avoid being seen. Against humans, night could have been better, but the huge eyes of the aliens and the way they seemed to move suggested better night vision than humans. They might even be nocturnal. He saw one more group of 3 of the aliens as he moved back. He watched them just long enough to establish that they were as careless with their weapons as the others. The city was abandoned. The aliens seemed to have no interest in human technology, and their weapons seemed designed to only target things that were alive. That made the next couple of days much easier. Most of the city infrastructure was still working, and there was plenty of food. So he picked a random apartment in a random building and waited. Eventually, the aliens would leave, or so he assumed. And then the next attack came. He didn't fully understand why or how, but they triggered an earthquake. It wasn't huge, more like a warning shot, but that was enough to disrupt almost everything. He could still find water and food, but the refrigerators stopped, as did the faucets, so he had to move more. As Ollie navigated through the dimly lit streets, he couldn't help but feel a chilling unease. Ollie found solace in the small victories. A can of beans here, a bottle of water there. But as the days wore on, the signs of alien activity became increasingly hard to ignore. Not in the form of direct encounters, Ollie had become adept at evading those, but in the subtler shifts in the environment around him. The air grew thicker, almost charged with anticipation, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Birds, once abundant in the city's parks, had all but disappeared. Even the weather seemed to conspire against him, with sudden storms erupting out of nowhere, their ferocity unmatched by any he had experienced before. One evening, as Ollie scavenged for supplies in an abandoned grocery store, he heard a low hum. A few days ago, he would have assumed a light was broken. But in the new silence of the city, he knew it was connected to the aliens. He slipped out of the store, concealing himself in the shadows as the hum grew closer. Peering around a corner, he saw a small drone, no bigger than a bird, zipping through the air. It moved with purpose, scanning the ground below with an array of sensors that glowed faintly in the twilight. Ollie's heart raced. The aliens hadn't been as skilled as he was. He doubted they had seen much combat. But a drone was different. But it was also different for Ollie. After he left the service, he had known he wouldn't fight again. He had seen too much death. The drone wasn't alive. For now, he retreated into the depths of the city, moving from shadow to shadow, avoiding the open streets. His mind raced with possibilities, each more dire than the last. The earthquakes, the storms, the disappearance of wildlife, all of it pointed to a larger plan, one that Ollie couldn't begin to comprehend. What had become clear with every change in the weather, every drone he saw, and every aftershock was that he was fighting a losing battle. He was trying to survive one more day on a world that would eventually shrug him off. And then one of the drones spotted him. He expected it to shoot him. With how reckless their soldiers were, there would be no reason at all for them to put any restraints on the drone. It simply followed him. As he moved away, he put the gun that he had been given back together. Perhaps it was him slipping, but shooting a drone didn't feel the same as killing. He felt the weight of the gun in his hand. He had shot guns hundreds of times. Most of that was training, shooting at things no more alive than this drone, but those weren't the moments he thought of. He thought of the times when they had been real. Enemies, or so he was told. But he had never been fully able to convince himself of that. He had only convinced himself that it was them or him. The camera on the drone looked almost like an eye, but too large. A bit like the eyes of the aliens. He aimed carefully as it bounced in the air like it was floating on top of an invisible lake. Ollie barely heard the gunshot, and the drone's camera seemed to explode in slow motion. The second time he shot, it was a bit easier. That was what he was afraid of. Shooting things had always been too easy. The third time it went down. He turned and walked away, reminding himself it was just metal. Over the next couple of hours, it became clear that he had waited too long. He didn't know exactly how he had been tagged. Perhaps it had marked him when it scanned him, or perhaps it had been invisible. Whatever it was, the city was flooded with the aliens. Most of them were drones. They were the same type. The first hadn't been difficult to destroy, but even if he could shoot them, it wouldn't stop the armada of aliens from sending more. He only saw 6 of the actual aliens. 2 teams of 3. But it was obvious that they knew where he was. And they were unwilling to allow even a single human to survive, to live free. This wasn't the same as the people he had fought before. These weren't poor farmers trying to protect what little they had. They were the invaders. The people in the woods who insisted they fight back might be children who didn't have any idea what war was or the cost of that fight, but that didn't mean they were wrong. Why shouldn't he fight back? Just because he was better at it. It wouldn't even be hard. The alien soldiers were clearly not trained in urban combat. Their entire strategy seemed to be to shoot a lot and hope they hit things. The many walls in the city made that far less effective. Their guns destroyed anything that was alive, but were stopped by things that a bullet would easily go through. So all he had to do was find a place where they couldn't hit him easily, and once he had one of their guns, it might turn things around, or at least let him hurt them like they had hurt so many other people. What he picked was an industrial stairwell. The metal stairs had plenty of holes he could shoot through, but the small area and narrow gaps would make their weapons almost impossible to use effectively. With more time, he might have set some traps. He had seen firsthand how devastating a simple trap could be, but they were only a few seconds behind him. So he waited. The first of the three came in. It was tall and thin, with a mask over its face. Its hands shook as it sprayed the room with purple energy. Ollie's gambit had worked, and the metal of the stairwell protected him from the shots. He lifted the gun, a clear and easy shot. Instead, he stepped out from behind his cover. The alien froze and then dropped its weapon. It was entirely alien, and exactly the same as everyone else that Ollie had killed. Ollie allowed the rage of what had happened to his world to flow through him. He could feel the trigger under his finger. He could see the terror in the eyes of the creature. He imagined the empty city streets, the empty schools, the countless lives that were gone. And this wouldn't change any of that. He wasn't even fighting to save anyone. He didn't know if there was anyone left. This was just revenge. And not even useful revenge. It wouldn't stop them from going to the next world. It would simply end the life of one terrified person. The gun fell to the ground next to the alien's weapon. The alien lifted its eyes and looked at Ollie, and for a moment he thought he saw understanding. Then one of the other two aliens shot Ollie. There was a white void. It was empty and alone. He was there only long enough to think, so this is death. It wasn't so bad. No pain, no desire, nothing but the calm white. And then it was gone. He found himself back in the stairwell. It was more worn than it had been. One of the stairs had rusted partway through, and there was a small pool of water with a sheen of oil on top of it. He looked down, expecting to see his gun, but it wasn't there. So he stepped out unarmed. There were several other, confused people in the lobby of the building. They barely acknowledged him, as they all walked out onto the street. It was even more clear now that time had passed. There were trees and grass everywhere, though the city was still there. Other people stepped out of buildings, or stood in the middle of what had once been a road next to old cars. He looked up and once again saw the massive ships. They weren't much bigger than dots in the sky from this distance, but they were still there. And then he heard something. It wasn't quite speaking, but it was closer to that than anything else. It said, "We apologize for the confusion you must be feeling. There was no time to learn your languages before the dark matter anomaly struck your world. We saved as many as we could. You have each spent the last 100 years in a dimension without time. That has given your world time to repair itself. We understand that a great deal of effort will be needed to repair your world, but we will help." There was a moment of silence, and many of the people began talking. Then the voice continued, though no one else responded to it. It said, "For those of you who resisted, we hold no ill will. We would have done the same. If you are injured, please ask for help. We forgive you." Ollie smiled, not because they had forgiven him, but because they hadn't needed to. He had held back and not killed the terrified soldier. No, not a soldier, they weren't attacking. He hadn't killed a rescue worker. And he finally believed what he had been telling himself for years. He was a man of peace. Author's note.
I had a lot of fun writing this story. I like writing action, but don't do it as much as I probably should. There are a lot of reasons for that. The biggest is the old saying that if violence is the answer, then you're asking the wrong questions. That isn't to say that there aren't excellent reasons to fight. Just that, especially in fiction, we are all too quick to jump to it as an option. Which was why I enjoyed writing a story where I can have some action, while also making the avoidance of violence a major theme. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, you can sign up for my newsletter at sci-fi.com or join my Patreon and get access to the many Patreon exclusive stories at patreon.com/Elton. Thank you. Elton Gar.